I think when we talk about social business being possible, we should first of all recognise that all business is already social, of course, and that it has social impact. And there are already many positive examples of how this might happen in practice. Most of them tend to focus on improving efficiency through reducing resource or minimising waste or reputational gains. But I think beyond that, I think it's important to think about the role of innovation and creativity and more ambitious approaches that are going to take us towards the net zero economy that we're all moving to in the future. Also, I think when we're speaking about social business, we are interested in the idea that social mission and business imperatives can coexist in a productive way. This is clearly a good idea, but it also points to the reality that these forces can be in conflict with one another. What we also tend to overlook, I think, is the dynamics of mixing social and business imperatives. From this point of view, the evidence from academia suggests that rather than these things blending together very easily, they tend not to necessarily mix that well, and they can tend to either overshadow or be prioritised. So rather than seeking to oversimplify problems of social mission through metrics of impact, I think we should also try to acknowledge the complex and subjective nature of social business. And to some extent, impact therefore will always be subjective and contextual. Measuring this is still important, but I think in addition we should be encouraging positive cultures of adaptation and learning within the organisation and its stakeholders. Looking at the differences between enterprises and social enterprises, given the enthusiasm with which many commercial enterprises are embracing social objectives, it can be hard sometimes to delineate the differences and boundaries between conventional business and social business. In the past, different legal and governance structures have existed, but it's also the case that new organisational forms are emerging, such as B corporations, which formally include other stakeholders' interests in the governance of the organisation. Looking at the relationship between business imperatives and social mission, it tends to be the case that in the evolution of the organisation, one has come before the other. That story of evolution can be important in how the organisation manages those social and business imperatives. What I think is key about this is the extent to which social mission is integrated and embedded, if you like, with the organisation's DNA. Some commercial enterprises are beginning to develop effective methods for them to achieve this. But at the same time, I think the challenge for social enterprise is not to lose sight of its social mission whilst at the same time meeting the demands of impact investment. I think it's essential to recognise the need to work within ecological limits whilst pursuing a social mission. After all, we're moving to a net zero economy, and that's going to involve major transition challenges with implications for energy resources, energy use, waste and emissions. Environmental impacts are in some ways less subjective and less complex than social outcomes, and so measurement is potentially more feasible. I think initially the focus should be on avoiding minimising harm in terms of resource use and waste, and the potential savings or efficiency gains can be another incentive for managing environmental impact. Going further though, I think more ambitious steps to minimise impact could involve greater recognition of hidden environmental costs, such as the carbon footprint of our travelling that we do. That's a very good question. I think perhaps in some ways the key to that is thinking about taking a longer term perspective. I think that applies to finance but also to social impact as well. I think we need to recognise and account for the negative as well as the positive impacts of what we do. The principle of donut economics, for example, developed by Kate Rayworth, talks about defining a safe operating space for humanity which respects the ecological limits but also the minimum social thresholds of well-being. I think in terms of the field of finance, finding and supporting the right investors who don't rush to apply conventional tools and a conventional mindset based on what they already know is important. But also I think appreciating and engaging with the complexity of social systems and interventions in those systems is important. Finally, I think creating spaces for investors and social businesses to interact, for example through the development of social stock exchanges, would be a really good step in the right direction.
I would say in many cases it's not only possible but a constant challenge, for founders not to lose sight of their impact. Even in cases where there is a high degree of lockstep between financial value creation and impact creation, there are many choices that founders face where they can decide in favor of one or the other. So in general, my impression is that the change, the positive change that you want to measure and that is being created doesn't depend on the organizational structure of the change-making organization. It's in both cases, both set of tools apply, and actually I would say there is a potential for cross-fertilization. So the methods that non-profit organizations apply and have developed, impact investors and social entrepreneurs can learn from them, and vice versa, right? So there's frameworks and methods and tools that impact investors have developed that NGOs can profit from as well. For sure there is, I would say. I mean, it's nice to see that the mainstream financial sector is increasing its allocation for impact investing, but I think it's also important to realize or recognize that for example, institutional investors have strict legal requirements, minimum requirements on the financial return risk profile of an investment. And so as long as investments don't meet that profile, even though they do create impact, and we see there's a large number of entrepreneurial approaches to solving societal challenges that just don't meet this minimum criteria. So it's certainly, unless we have a system in place that starts to provide the legal mandate and the incentives to mainstream investors, the leeway to have a different set of minimum criteria, an intermediary can help to, simulate this incentive structure that we maybe need in the interim, right? So, yeah. So in general, as an organization, we are looking into both dimensions of impact. One is the impact creation, right, and the other is the impact orientation. And so, in order to measure impact creation, there is a variety of tools available. There is also the SRS reporting standard. There is, if you look at the impact investing space, the impact management project, and so on. What I also notice is that empirical social sciences provide also tools, to measure changes in attitudes, knowledge, and behavior. Oftentimes, social entrepreneurs are not aware of these tools. On the other hand, in terms of impact orientation, this is something that you can measure by auditing the organization. You look into organizational processes and how they are, practiced and lived and documented and so on. So a PHINEO methodology to apply this, and taking both dimensions together is, I think, important to get a clear picture.